On a rainy Thursday evening, when the kind of cold that settles into bones rather than skin had wrapped itself around the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Ethan Cole stood beneath a single flickering fluorescent light and stared at a cardboard box he had not touched in more than 2 decades. He had almost ignored the phone call from the storage facility manager, the one warning him that unclaimed units would be cleared out by the end of the month. He had almost let the whole thing go, but some quiet pull he couldn't name, had brought him here anyway, standing in the damp smell of old paper and forgotten things. Pulling open a box that smelled like another lifetime, tucked beneath a folded flannel shirt and a handful of loose photographs, was a flip phone, its casing cracked along one corner, its screen completely black. Curious in the way a man gets when he has run out of other feelings to feel, Ethan slipped it into his jacket pocket and carried it home through the rain. He charged it overnight on the kitchen counter while he slept badly, as he always did. The next morning, when the screen blinked to life for the first time in 20 years, a single notification sat waiting for him like a held breath, one unheard voice message, time-stamped on a date he would not place until later. What he heard when he pressed play made his blood run cold in a way he had not felt since the worst day of his life. The trembling voice on the other end belonged to a young woman begging for help, speaking words meant for someone who had never heard them. Ethan Cole never imagined that pressing that button would pull him out of the life he had quietly given up on, and into the hidden grief of the most powerful woman in the city. Ethan was 42 years old, and he carried his years the way a man carries a heavy coat he no longer remembers taking off the hook constantly. Without thinking, until the weight becomes indistinguishable from the weight of himself. He had not always been this way. There were photographs still hanging on the walls of his small house on the edge of Millbrook that showed another version of him entirely. A man with his arm around a laughing woman, a man who had once taken up too much space in a room in the best possible sense. Her name had been Laura. She had died of a sudden illness 7 years ago. And Ethan had dealt with it the way certain kinds of men deal with unbearable things, by continuing to go through the motions of a life, while slowly allowing the interior of that life to go dark. He still went to work every morning at the municipal planning office, still came home every evening to the same small house, still heated something from a can or a box and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table alone felt like too much of a statement about the state of things. He still folded his clothes and kept his car in working order and paid his bills on time. From the outside, Ethan Cole was a functioning man. From the inside, he was a house with the lights left on to fool burglars. The watch still sat on the nightstand. Laura's watch, a thin silver thing with a worn leather band that she had inherited from her grandmother and worn every day without exception. After she died, Ethan had placed it there as though setting it down for a moment. And 7 years later, it was still there, still stopped at the same time, the leather band slowly drying out in the dry air of a bedroom where no one slept well anymore. He did not move it because moving it felt like an admission he was not ready to make. He was not sure what admission exactly, only that it involved accepting that some things do not come back, and he had not yet made peace with that particular truth. He told himself often, usually in the evenings, usually after a second glass of whatever he was drinking, that his life had probably already reached its meaningful chapters, and what remained was simply the long tail end, the part of the story that happens after the important parts are finished. He was not dramatic about it. He did not weep or despair in any visible way. He simply moved through his days like a man walking a familiar route in the dark, one careful step at a time, not expecting anything to change. The call from the storage unit facility came on a Wednesday morning while he was eating toast over the sink. The manager, a friendly enough man named Gerald, explained that Ethan's unit number 47, the one registered under his late friend Daniel Marsh's name, which Ethan had taken over the payments on years ago and then slowly forgotten about, would be liquidated at the end of the month if not cleared. Ethan had not thought about Daniel in a long time. Daniel had been his closest friend through most of his 20s, a loud and generous man who could make any room feel warmer, who had died in a car accident at 31 in the kind of sudden, senseless way that made the people left behind feel cheated in a way they couldn't quite articulate. Ethan had handled the storage unit as a favor and had never quite gotten around to dealing with the contents. Now, standing in the rain outside Unit 47 on a Thursday evening, Key in hand, he felt the strange, accumulated weight of all that postponement pressing down on him at once. He opened the door. He pulled the cord on the bare bulb inside. He found the cardboard box. He found the phone, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole felt something other than the low, steady hum of absence. He felt curious. He charged the phone overnight on the kitchen counter, and in the morning he stood in his robe with his coffee going cold beside him and watched the screen flicker and load. The phone was slow to wake, as though it too had been asleep for 20 years and was remembering itself piece by piece. When it finally settled, the display showed one notification, stark and simple against the gray background, one unheard voice message. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. He set down the coffee. He pressed play. The recording began with the ambient sound of wind or traffic, or both a rushing background noise that made the voice harder to hear. And then the voice came through, and it was young, and it was frightened, and it was breaking in real time as it spoke. "If anyone hears this," the woman said, and her voice caught before she could continue, "please tell Charlotte, please tell her that I didn't leave her. I tried to come back. I tried so hard to come back." There was a sound, then something between a breath and a sob, and the woman's voice dropped lower, more intimate, as though she had leaned closer to the phone to say the next part privately, for Charlotte alone. "I love her more than anything in this world. I need her to know that. I need her to know that I didn't choose to go." The message ended. The ambient noise cut off. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Ethan played it again. He stood there in his robe with the morning light coming gray through the window, and he played it 3 times, 4 times, until the words had settled into him and something he could not immediately name had begun to stir. Charlotte. Who was Charlotte? Who was this woman? And why had she called Daniel's phone? Why had the message never been heard? He turned the phone over in his hands, as though the casing might offer answers, and then he noticed the timestamp, not the date it had been left in the interface, but the actual recorded date that appeared when he navigated into the message details. He read it twice to make sure he was reading correctly. The message had been left on the 14th of March. 20 years ago. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. He knew that date. He did not know immediately why he knew it. Only that the number moved something in him, the way a smell can move you before your conscious mind has caught up to the memory. He set the phone down on the counter and went to his laptop and typed the date into a search alongside Daniel's name. And then, 2 searches later, alongside the phrase "accident Millbrook." What came back from the archives of a local newspaper made him sit down slowly in his kitchen chair and remain there for a very long time, reading and rereading while his coffee went entirely cold beside him. Charlotte Sinclair was the kind of woman whose name filled a room before she entered it. At 39, she was the founder and chief executive of Sinclair Technologies, a company she had built from a single rented office and a laptop into a corporation valued at several $billion and operating across 4 continents. Her face had appeared on the cover of Forbes twice. She had been profiled by every major publication, interviewed on every major network, and had given a keynote address at a technology conference the previous year that had been quoted and requoted thousands of times across the industry. She was brilliant, relentless, and almost entirely without warmth, at least publicly, at least in the ways that the people around her could observe. Her executives described her as demanding. Her competitors described her as ruthless. The journalists who had tried to get close to her personal life had come away with almost nothing, because Charlotte Sinclair did not have a personal life that she allowed anyone to see. She had a penthouse apartment in the city that she slept in fewer than 4 nights a week. She had a trainer and a driver and a small circle of trusted colleagues. She did not have close friends. She did not, as far as anyone could observe, have a romantic partner. She had the company. And the company was her whole world, and she had built it that way on purpose. What the profiles and the interviews and the keynote addresses did not mention, because Charlotte had never told anyone who might write it down, was the place where she had spent the first 8 years of her life, the Maplewood Children's Home in Dunmore County, a state facility for children without families, where she had arrived as an infant and remained until she was adopted at age 8 by a wealthy industrialist named Harold Beckett. The adoption had changed the trajectory of her life in material terms. Beckett had provided education, resources, opportunity, but the 8 years before him had already formed her in ways that no amount of wealth could undo. She had learned, in those 8 years, that people leave, that the ones who say they love you do not always stay, that the safest thing, the only truly safe thing, was to need no one, to build something so solid and so entirely your own that no one's departure could touch it. Charlotte had believed, with a certainty that had calcified into the very foundation of her adult self, that her mother had left her willingly, that she had been placed in that home and forgotten, that whatever love might have existed once had not been strong enough to overcome the simple practical preference for a different kind of life. This belief was the central wound of Charlotte Sinclair, the one from which all her defenses had grown like scar tissue. Tough and useful, and entirely without feeling. Ethan saw her on television on a Sunday morning, 4 days after finding the phone. He had been doing research, pulling up whatever he could find about the accident that the newspaper archive had referenced. And he had the television on low in the background, the way he usually did for company, and suddenly, the image on the screen resolved into a face being interviewed by a news anchor, and the anchor said the name Charlotte Sinclair, and Ethan went entirely still. He watched her speak. She was poised and precise, and kept her hands folded on the desk in front of her, in the controlled way of someone who has trained herself out of nervous habits. She was beautiful in the complicated way that very serious, very self-contained people sometimes are, as though the beauty costs her something. And something about her face, some quality he could not name, made the hairs on the back of his arm rise. When the segment ended, Ethan sat for a long time with the remote in his hand, and the question that had been forming for 4 days finally sharpened into something clean and urgent. Was the Charlotte in the message this Charlotte? Was it possible? He started with newspaper archives. He spent 3 evenings at the public library, going through microfilm records from 20 years ago, searching for any mention of the accident date. The name Emily Hart. The name Charlotte. The librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Delacroix, helped him navigate the system without asking too many questions. And on the 3rd evening, Ethan found what he was looking for. A small item in the local paper, buried on page 8, reporting that a woman named Emily Hart had been involved in a single-vehicle accident on the 14th of March on Route 11 outside of Dunmore County. The item noted she was being treated at Dunmore General and listed no further details. A follow-up he found 2 weeks later noted only that Emily Hart had been reported missing and that authorities believed she had left the area voluntarily. Ethan read that sentence 3 times. Voluntarily. He thought about the voice on the phone, the raw, terrified love in it, the desperation, the specific words. I tried to come back. He did not believe for one moment that Emily Hart had left voluntarily. He went to the county records office the next morning. He went to the police department the following afternoon. He found what public records existed and noted what was conspicuously absent. Then he found the name Beckett in the adoption filing records connected to a girl named Charlotte Hart, age 8, adopted in the spring following the accident. Charlotte Hart. He sat outside the records office in his car and gripped the steering wheel and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific, electric urgency of a person who has just realized that what they are holding matters enormously. The witness was a man named Roy Simmons, 73 years old, living in a nursing facility in Dunmore County. Ethan found his name through a combination of old police records. A retired deputy who had been willing to talk after Ethan bought him coffee and listened patiently for an hour, and a single handwritten name in the margin of a faded incident report that no one had ever followed up on. Roy had been a mechanic at the garage where Emily Hart's car had been towed after the accident. He had also, it turned out, been a witness to something that had never made it into any official report. The nursing facility smelled of institutional cleaning solution and cafeteria food, and the common room where Ethan found Roy was occupied by a handful of other residents. Some watching the television mounted in the corner, some simply sitting with the particular patience of people who have made peace with stillness. Roy Simmons was a small man who had once been larger. You could see the former size of him in the broad frame. The wide hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, the shoulders that had not entirely given up their posture, despite everything. He listened as Ethan explained what he had found. The phone, the message, the timeline, the name, Emily Hart. He listened without interrupting, which Ethan had learned by then was the quality of a person who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation. When Ethan finished, Roy looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said, quietly, "I wondered if anyone would ever come." What Roy Simmons told him took less than 20 minutes to say, and dismantled everything the official record had claimed. Emily Hart's car had not gone off the road on its own. Roy had seen a second vehicle, a dark luxury sedan, and he had seen it make contact with Emily's car in a way that looked deliberate. He had told the deputy who took his statement. The deputy had taken notes, and then told Roy that what he had seen was probably just a near miss. A scared driver who left the scene, not worth pursuing. The deputy had been a younger man at the time. Roy had later found out that the deputy's career had improved substantially in the years following that conversation. Roy had put two and two together, and then put the whole thing away in a part of his memory where things go when a person decides they cannot afford to know them. Now, 20 years later, he was old and tired, and had decided he could afford it after all. He told Ethan the name of the man who owned the dark sedan. He had recognized the plates, had known the car, because it belonged to a man everyone in Dunmore County knew. Harold Beckett, the file that had held Roy Simmons's original witness statement, had gone missing from the county records office sometime in the year following the accident. Ethan discovered this when he went back to verify the records he had already pulled, and found a gap in the filing sequence that corresponded exactly to that period. He did not need anyone to explain to him what that meant. He was careful about who he spoke to after that. He noticed, in the days following his conversation with Roy, that the same black SUV seemed to appear on his street with some regularity. A call came to his home phone. He still had a landline, because Laura had liked them from an unknown number. The voice on the other end said nothing specific. It only said that some things were better left alone, and then the line went dead. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a long moment, and then, slowly, felt something that surprised him. He was not afraid. He was angry, and he was determined. And underneath both of those things, he was more fully present in his own life than he had been in years. He went back to his laptop. He kept working. The evidence, when he had gathered enough of it, told a story that was both simple and devastating. Harold Beckett had been a man who wanted things and was accustomed to obtaining them. He had wanted Charlotte not necessarily out of love, though perhaps there had been some version of that too, but out of the specific desire of a powerful man to possess something rare and unclaimed. Emily Hart had been fighting for custody of her daughter through the courts, a process that had been slow and difficult because she had no money, and Beckett had a great deal of it. The accident on Route 11 had not been an accident. Beckett had ensured that Emily did not make it to the custody hearing that was scheduled for the following week. He had then ensured that the official record reflected a woman who had left voluntarily, rather than a woman who had been silenced. He had then adopted Charlotte through proper legal channels, using his connections to smooth over the procedural complications, and had raised her in his household until his death from natural causes 14 years later, when Charlotte was 22 and had already begun building what would become Sinclair Technologies. Beckett had died a respected man. His name was on a library wing in Dunmore County. He had never faced a single consequence. Ethan drove to the headquarters of Sinclair Technologies on a Tuesday morning and was, as he had expected, turned away at the reception desk. He returned on Wednesday and Thursday and was turned away both times, each time by increasingly firm security personnel. He left a letter on Friday, addressed directly to Charlotte Sinclair, explaining in 3 concise paragraphs that he had information about her mother. On Monday morning, he received a call from Charlotte's personal assistant, who said, in a tone that communicated very clearly that this was a significant and probably unrepeatable concession, that Miss Sinclair would see him for 5 minutes on Wednesday at 2 o'clock. He wore the same jacket he had worn to every important moment in his adult life. A dark blue wool, one that Laura had given him for his birthday years ago. He arrived 10 minutes early. He was made to wait 35 minutes past the scheduled time. He waited without complaint, because he had learned, in the past several weeks, that patience was the only useful thing he had to offer. Charlotte Sinclair's office occupied the entire top floor of the Sinclair building, and it had the quality of a room that had been designed to make visitors feel small, which was almost certainly intentional. She was standing when he was shown in, not behind her desk but at the window, looking out over the city, with her arms crossed and her expression the specific kind of neutral that takes considerable effort to maintain. She did not offer her hand. She did not invite him to sit. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already categorized and found unimportant. "You have 5 minutes," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, and entirely without warmth. Ethan had rehearsed what he was going to say. He said it anyway, plainly. He had found a voice message left on a phone belonging to a man named Daniel Marsh, 20 years ago, from a woman named Emily Hart, who was asking for Charlotte. Charlotte's expression did not change. She said, "I have heard many stories from many people, and not one of them has been true. I don't know what you want, but I can tell you that whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Ethan nodded. He did not argue. He took out his phone, opened the audio file he had recorded from the old flip phone, and set it on the edge of her desk. Then he pressed play. The voice filled the room, the wind noise, the trembling urgency, the words that had waited 20 years to be heard. "I didn't leave her. I tried to come back. I love her more than anything in this world." Charlotte Sinclair stood at the window with her arms still crossed and her face still controlled. And then something happened that was not controlled at all. She went very still, in the way a person goes still when something reaches past every defense they have built and lands directly on the wound, underneath. The room was absolutely silent when the message ended. Ethan did not speak. He waited. And then, Charlotte Sinclair, who had not cried in front of another person in as long as she could remember, pressed one hand over her mouth and turned away toward the window, and her shoulders shook once, very slightly, before she stilled them. When she turned back, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with light. "Play it again," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan played it again, this time, standing very still with her hands at her sides and her eyes closed. Charlotte listened to her mother's voice for only the second time in her life, and the first time with any understanding of what it meant. She had told herself the story for so long that it had become indistinguishable from memory. Her mother had left her. Her mother had placed her in the children's home and chosen not to come back. Every institution she had ever built, every wall she had ever raised, every relationship she had allowed to fail by simply not trying hard enough to save it, all of it was built on that story, on the foundational belief that she had been unwanted, that love was a transaction that others could walk away from without looking back. She had been successful in ways that most people would call extraordinary, and she had been successful in the way that people are sometimes successful when they are running from something with a ferocity born not entirely from ambition but from the need to prove, to no one in particular and to everyone simultaneously, that she did not need anyone, that she had never needed anyone, that whatever had been taken from her at the beginning had not mattered because she had built something better than whatever had been taken. Charlotte told Ethan some of this. Not all of it. She was not the kind of person who told strangers all of anything but enough that he understood the shape of the wound, even if he didn't see every edge of it. She listened to the message again. And again. She sat in the chair, across from the desk, where she usually sat behind the desk. And Ethan sat in the chair across from her, and they sat in the rapidly darkening office as the afternoon shifted toward evening, and Charlotte talked for the first time in her adult life about what it had been like to grow up believing what she had believed. She talked about the children's home not with self-pity, but with the careful, precise language of someone cataloging damage rather than dramatizing it. She talked about Harold Beckett and how she had been grateful to him for the resources he had provided while never quite trusting him, never quite understanding the faint unease that had lived in her chest during the years she had lived in his house. She talked about how she had poured every ounce of herself into building Sinclair Technologies, because the company was the one thing in the world that was entirely hers, that had come from her own effort and her own mind, and could not be taken back. Ethan listened. He did not offer reassurances or interpretations. He simply listened, the way a person listens when they understand that the most important thing they can give someone is the experience of being heard without interruption. When Charlotte finally stopped talking, the office was nearly dark, and she looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who has put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time. "I'm going to need to know the rest," she said. "I need to know everything." Ethan nodded. "I'll tell you everything I know," he said, "and then we'll find the rest together." What Charlotte brought to the investigation that Ethan had not been able to bring alone was resources, the ability to hire researchers, to retain lawyers, to access records that had not been available to a man with a library card and a lot of patience. What she found, over the weeks that followed, was not substantially different from what Ethan had found, but it was more complete, and completeness, it turned out, was what she needed. The full picture was this: Emily Hart had loved her daughter with everything she had. She had fought for her through a system that had not been designed to help women without money fight men with lawyers. On the night of the 14th of March, she had been driving back from a meeting with her attorney. Having been told that the custody hearing would proceed the following week and that her chances, while uncertain, were not hopeless, she had not arrived home. The accident had been engineered. She had survived it initially, which was why she had managed to leave the voice message, calling from the hospital on a borrowed phone, trying to reach someone who might get word to Charlotte before the situation became irreversible. But she had not survived the night. The hospital records, obtained finally through a combination of legal filings and considerable patience, showed that Emily Hart had died in the early hours of the 15th of March from complications related to her injuries. She had been 31 years old. She had spent her final hours trying to get a message to her daughter. Harold Beckett had been dead for 15 years. There was no trial to pursue, no confrontation to be had, no scene of justice to be witnessed. This was perhaps the hardest part, the absence of anywhere to direct the outrage, the grief, the need for some external reckoning that would feel proportionate to what had been done. The man who had engineered Emily Hart's death and then built his respectable legacy on top of that crime had died peacefully, with his name on a library wing, mourned by colleagues and business associates who had known only the version of him that he had chosen to present to the world. Charlotte learned this over the course of several days, and she processed it the way she processed most things, not aloud, not visibly, but in the sustained interior work of a person who has had long practice at containing very large feelings in a very controlled exterior. Ethan watched her during those days and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help. He brought food sometimes, when they were working at his kitchen table. He made coffee without being asked. He understood, from his own years of living inside a loss that had no resolution, that the absence of a satisfying conclusion is not the same as the absence of meaning, and that the grief does not require a target to be real and worth feeling. Charlotte sat with this for a long time. Ethan sat with her when she needed company, and gave her space when she needed that. He did not try to resolve it for her, because he understood from his own experience that some things cannot be resolved from the outside. That the only way through certain kinds of grief is simply to go through them, slowly, step by step, until you arrive somewhere on the other side that is different from where you started, even if it is not entirely better. The cemetery in Dunmore County was small and old and well kept, with oak trees that had been growing for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. Emily Hart's grave was modest, a simple stone with her name and dates, placed there by a county official in the absence of family. Because there had been no family to place it, Charlotte stood in front of it on a Thursday morning in early November, with Ethan a few feet behind her, and the oak trees releasing their last leaves around them in the still air. She had the audio file on her phone. She played it, standing there, not because she needed to hear it again, but because it seemed right, because it seemed like the appropriate way to introduce herself, finally, to the person she had been waiting, without knowing it, to meet. The voice came out of the small speaker and dissolved into the cold November air. "I didn't leave her. I tried to come back. I love her more than anything in this world." Charlotte stood very still and let the whole thing move through her. Then she said, very quietly, the words she had never been able to say before, the words that had been waiting in her since before she was old enough to know what they meant. "I know. Mom, I know you didn't leave." She paused. "The leaves fell. I forgive you for not making it back, and I'm glad you tried." Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She cried without trying to stop it, without turning away, without managing it. She simply stood there and let it happen. And Ethan stood quietly behind her. Not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be present, which was the only thing required of him, and exactly the right thing. The changes in Charlotte Sinclair were not sudden or dramatic. They were the kind of changes that people who knew her well noticed gradually, a slightly longer pause before she responded to things. A marginally softer quality in her voice when speaking to her staff, an occasional question asked out of what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than strategic information gathering. She began holding monthly lunches with small groups of employees, rotating through departments, eating in the common area rather than her office. She began returning calls and emails that she previously would have left to her assistant. She told a junior developer, who had brought a flawed but genuinely original idea to a company meeting and had been bracing for a methodical dismantling of everything wrong with it, that the core concept was interesting and worth developing further. The developer had looked so startled that Charlotte had made a private note to herself to consider how she had been showing up for the people who worked for her. These were small things, but small things, done consistently and with intention, become the texture of a life, and Charlotte's life was beginning, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable effort, to have a different texture than it had before. The Emily Hart Foundation was Charlotte's idea, arrived at quickly, and executed with the efficiency that characterized everything she did when she had decided something was worth doing. It was a fund designed to support children in the foster care system, not with the vague goodwill of a general donation, but with specific, practical resources: legal advocacy for children and parents navigating custody proceedings, educational grants, mental health services, transition support for young adults aging out of care. Charlotte hired a director with actual expertise in child welfare and gave her the budget and the authority to build something real. There were long meetings and difficult conversations about scope and strategy, and the particular challenges of systemic problems that resist simple solutions, and Charlotte attended every one of them with the same focused seriousness she brought to the strategic planning sessions for Sinclair Technologies. Her executives noticed the shift in how she spent her time and interpreted it, some of them as evidence of a new philanthropic direction that would be good for the company's public profile. They were not wrong, but they were not entirely right either. Charlotte was not building the foundation for the company's benefit. She was building it because it was the most direct translation available to her of something she could not otherwise express: the debt she felt she owed to the mother she had never known, and the obligation she felt toward every child who was currently living inside the same wrong story that had defined the first 8 years of her life. She named it after her mother without deliberation, without hesitation, without the performance of sentiment that sometimes accompanies such gestures. It simply seemed to her that the name belonged there, that it was the most direct way she had of saying something she had spent her entire adult life unable to say. Charlotte asked Ethan one evening, sitting across from him in the small restaurant near his house that had become their usual meeting place over the months of investigation and its aftermath, why he had not given up. She asked it simply, without any particular framing, not as a compliment, not as a puzzle, just as a genuine question from a person who genuinely wanted to know. Ethan thought about it for a moment before he answered. The way he had learned, over the course of these months, to take her questions seriously enough to give them a real answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that I needed it as much as you did. Not the answer. I didn't need to know what the answer was. I needed to be the person who was looking for it." He paused. "I hadn't needed to be anything in a long time." Charlotte looked at him across the table with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. And he held her gaze without looking away. "The morning I found the phone," he continued, "I woke up and I was the same person I'd been every morning for 7 years. I went to bed that night as a completely different person. And I hadn't even done anything yet. I'd just found a reason to." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You found mine at the same time." Ethan nodded. "I think that's what happened," he said. Yes, he told her about Laura. He had not intended to. It was not a story he told people, but it came out that evening, naturally, the way things come out when the atmosphere is right, when you are sitting across from someone who has also lost something enormous and rebuilt themselves around the loss, however imperfectly. Charlotte listened the way Ethan had learned to listen, completely, without offering anything until the telling was finished. When he was done, she said only, "She sounds like someone worth grieving." It was the exact right thing to say. And Ethan had not known until he heard it that it was what he had needed someone to say for 7 years. He looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I forgot that grieving her meant I was still living, that as long as the grief was there, so was I." Charlotte reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, not a romantic gesture exactly, but not entirely without that quality either. Something between comfort and recognition, between the warmth of a friend and the possibility of something not yet named. Ethan did not say anything. He turned his hand over so that her hand rested in his palm. And they sat like that for a moment, in the small restaurant near his house, while the dinner crowd moved around them and the evening continued outside the windows. The formal dedication of the Emily Hart Foundation took place on a Saturday morning in late spring, in the atrium of the Sinclair Technologies building, with enough people present that the space was comfortably full without being overwhelming. Charlotte had not wanted it to be an event in the way that corporate charity events tend to be. She had been to enough of those to know that they can end up being more about the people giving than the people they are supposed to help. She had asked for something quieter, more focused, with the people who actually worked in child welfare and foster care given the opportunity to speak. She had asked Ethan to stand beside her, and he had agreed without making a thing of it. He wore the blue jacket. Charlotte spoke briefly and without notes. She told the room, plainly and without performing emotion, that the foundation was named for her mother, that she had grown up not knowing her mother, and had spent most of her adult life believing a story about her mother that had turned out not to be true, and that she had learned the truth because a stranger had found a lost voice message and had not been able to let it go. She did not say that the experience had changed her. It seemed too simple a thing to say about something so large. She only said that she was grateful, and that she hoped the foundation would mean that fewer children would have to spend their lives carrying the wrong story about the people who had loved them. There was applause, measured and genuine. Ethan stood beside her and clapped with the rest of the room and caught her eye and saw there, briefly and unmistakably, something that looked like the first complete version of happiness he had ever seen on her face. Afterward, outside on the steps in the mild spring air, before the next portion of the day pulled Charlotte back into the duties of being Charlotte Sinclair, she stood next to Ethan and looked out at the street below. The city moved around them at its usual pace, indifferent and continuous. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the kind of question that had more than one meaning. Ethan considered it for a moment. He thought about the house in Millbrook, the photographs on the walls, and the watch on the nightstand. He thought about the way the last several months had felt not easy, not without pain, but charged with something he had forgotten was possible, the sense of being fully inside his own life, rather than watching it from a polite distance. He thought about Laura, and about the way grief, when you finally let it be what it is, can coexist with something that is not grief at all. "I think whatever happens," he said carefully, "it happens on purpose." "Not like before." Charlotte turned to look at him. "Not like before," she agreed. She did not smile. Exactly, she was not yet a person who smiled easily, and perhaps she never entirely would be. But something in her face had opened in a way it had not been opened before, a quality of attention directed at the present moment, rather than at the perimeter of it, where the dangers are. Ethan looked at her, and then he did something he had not done with genuine feeling in a very long time. He smiled. 1 year after the dedication, on a mild Saturday morning in a cemetery in Dunmore County, Charlotte Sinclair stood again in front of her mother's grave. She came alone this time, early, before the rest of the day had any claim on her. She had brought nothing, no flowers, no objects, only herself and the particular quality of presence she had been practicing. The kind that does not require anything from the moment except to be inside it. She stood quietly in the dappled morning light, the oak trees just beginning to open their leaves again after the long winter. And she spoke to her mother in the easy, private way she had slowly learned to speak to her over the course of the year, not performing grief, not asking for things that could not be given, just talking. The way you talk to someone you have known long enough to be comfortable with the silences. She said that the foundation was growing, that the first class of scholarship recipients had been announced, that the legal advocacy program had already helped 14 families through custody proceedings. She said she was learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to trust people, which she suspected would be a lifelong project. She said she was happier than she had been, which was a thing she had once believed she did not particularly need to be, and which she now understood was the most fundamental need there is. She stood there for a long while after she stopped speaking, just listening to the birds and the wind and the particular quiet of that place. Ethan was waiting for her at the gate when she walked back. He had a coffee for each of them from the place down the road, the kind with the paper cups and the lids that never fit quite right. He handed her one without ceremony and fell into step beside her as she walked. And for a while, they walked without speaking, through the gate and down the road toward the car, in the easy silence of people who have been through something significant together and no longer need to explain themselves to each other. The message had done its work. 20 years of waiting, and then a rainy Thursday evening, and a dead battery, and a man who had nothing better to do than be curious, and from all of that improbable sequence, 2 lives had been redirected into something they had not previously been, something larger and more present, and more willing to feel what there was to feel. Charlotte wrapped both hands around her cup and looked up at the sky, which was the particular blue of early spring mornings. And she heard, in some internal space she could not have named before this year, the faint echo of a voice she would carry with her for the rest of her life, trembling, urgent, luminous with love. I love her more than anything in this world. She heard it and did not flinch. She heard it and felt, all the way down, what it was to be known by someone who loved you before you were old enough to know you were worth loving. Ethan reached over and took her free hand, simply and without making anything of it. And Charlotte held on. A voice message left on a forgotten phone, never heard for 20 years, had found its way to the 2 people who needed it most. And in the finding, it had given back what neither of them had believed was still possible, a reason to begin again. The message had not resolved everything. It had not undone what had been done or restored what had been taken. It had not made the grief smaller or the years easier to look back on. What it had done was simpler and more profound than any of that. It had told the truth. It had said what had always been true, in the voice of the person who had known it first and most completely. And it had said it at the exact moment when 2 people were finally ready to hear it. Ethan walked beside Charlotte in the spring morning with his coffee cooling in his hand and felt, with a clarity that surprised him even now, that the storage locker and the old phone and the rainy Thursday evening had not been accidents of circumstance. Or perhaps they had been, and what mattered was not the mechanism but the choice to charge the battery, to press play, to drive to the library, to return to the records office, to leave the letter, to keep going. The choice, made again and again in small and ordinary ways, to remain a person to whom things could still matter. That was what the message had restored in him, before it restored anything in Charlotte, the simple, essential knowledge that he was still here, still capable of being moved, still able to care about something beyond the quiet management of his own surviving. Emily Hart had spoken into a phone on the worst night of her life and had trusted that her words would reach her daughter. They had taken 20 years to arrive. But they had arrived, and they had done everything she had hoped they would do, and more.